The room was thick, with the scent of leather chairs and expensive cologne, a space where deals worth billions shifted hands with nothing more than polite smiles and firm grips. One after another, the airline manager moved along the polished table, shaking hands with the investors who had gathered to hear his pitch. Each gesture looked routine, mechanical even, until it wasn't. When he reached the man seated at the center, his hand faltered. A blink too long, a hesitation that carried more weight than words. Instead of extending courtesy, the manager's wrist veered sharply, skipping to the next person in line as though the black CEO in front of him had never existed. The silence that followed wasn't loud, yet it pressed in like an invisible wall. It lasted 2 seconds, just long enough for everyone's attention to remain fixed on the presentation slides, and just long enough for the one man left hanging to feel the sting where a handshake should have been. A moment so quick most would dismiss it, but heavy enough that it carved itself into the air. His eyes held steady, his shoulders square, his face an iron mask. He gave nothing away. But beneath the surface, a storm gathered. That storm wasn't about pride. It wasn't even about insult. It was about decades of being watched, measured, and diminished by men who thought they owned the air they breathed. This wasn't the first slight he had endured in a boardroom, but it was going to be the last one carried out in silence. The manager didn't notice. He went on, shaking hands and offering thin smiles, oblivious to the decision that had already begun to form across the table. The numbers in his slideshow gleamed. The graphs climbed. The projections promised dazzling returns. But none of those figures would matter, not after the choice the CEO was about to make. Make sure you like and subscribe to this channel so you never miss these stories that reveal the hidden truths people rarely talk about. Back in that boardroom, the black CEO leaned back in his chair, fingers resting lightly on the leather folder before him. His mind was no longer on the charts, not on the expansion plan, not on the promises spilling across the screen. He was thinking about a simple truth. The handshake that never came was going to cost this airline everything. He had built his empire by knowing when to speak and when to strike. And as he straightened his tie and fixed his gaze on the man who had dismissed him, a single thought crystallized. One refusal, one decision, one phone call away from collapse. The airline manager had no idea yet, but that flicker of arrogance across the table would end up erasing $50 billion before the week was through. The boardroom was a theater dressed in money. Mahogany stretched across the table's surface, polished so well it reflected the overhead lights like a mirror. Leather chairs, deep and heavy, circled the space, each occupied by someone wearing a suit worth more than a year's salary to most. Every gesture was quiet, rehearsed, watches adjusted, cufflinks straightened, portfolios placed with delicate precision. It was the kind of room where silence itself had a dollar value, and only certain voices were permitted to fill it. Darius Cole sat among them, shoulders squared, posture unflinching. To the casual observer, he blended seamlessly into the fabric of power. His charcoal gray suit was bespoke, his shoes shined to a glass finish, his pen placed neatly beside his notes. But no matter how flawless the presentation, some eyes always looked through him instead of at him. He had felt it before, the pause, the flicker, the quiet dismissal dressed up as indifference. And he felt it now. A whisper drifted across from the far side of the table, low enough to be mistaken for nothing, sharp enough to slice. Diversity quota, one investor muttered to another, not realizing the words carried farther than intended. Or perhaps realizing it and not caring. Darius did not turn his head. He didn't allow his jaw to tighten. He let the phrase hang in the air, just as he had let similar words hang in countless rooms over the years. His silence was not surrender. It was memory. The airline manager stood at the head of the table, rehearsed charm in every syllable. He spoke about growth, market dominance, the kind of glossy phrases that made numbers sound like destiny. He swept his gaze across the group, stopping long enough to acknowledge each investor with a nod. When his eyes crossed Darius, they slid past, as though contact itself was optional. It wasn't the words that cut deepest in these rooms. It was the omissions. The way greetings skipped a name. The way a conversation shifted when he walked in. The way respect was given freely to others but rationed to him, like something that had to be earned twice as hard and still rarely granted in full. Those weren't accidents. They were messages. Darius had spent his life translating those messages. He knew the language of exclusion better than most. Raised in Newark by a single mother who worked 2 jobs, he had understood early what it meant to be underestimated. While others inherited opportunity, he had carved his path with sweat and long nights, first through Princeton, then Harvard Business School, then the merciless ladder of Wall Street. Every step had come with whispers of disbelief, eyes that narrowed, voices that questioned whether he belonged. He carried those ghosts with him still. Now he was the head of Cole Capital, a firm with a portfolio that could tilt markets, a reputation forged in fire. Yet in this room of suits, there were still those who saw only the color of his skin before the weight of his name. The airline manager clicked his remote, and the projector hummed to life. Slides appeared, graphs climbing, market shares expanding, revenue forecasts that painted a glittering horizon. "We expect to capture a dominant position in the Asian market within 3 years," the manager declared. His voice carried conviction, but it carried something else too. An undertone sharpened when he glanced at Darius, as though the presence of a black billionaire at his table was a blemish on the picture he wanted to paint. The investors leaned forward, nodding, eyes bright with opportunity. A few scribbled notes, a few exchanged murmurs of agreement. Darius remained still, hands folded lightly on the table. To move, to react, would be to give them something to interpret. He knew how rooms like this worked. Every motion dissected, every pause twisted into meaning. So he stayed still, the embodiment of composure, though inside his chest the old fire stirred. It wasn't rage that fueled him, not anymore. Rage was too easy, too visible. What burned was resolve, the kind built over decades of being told no, of being ignored, of being seen only when it suited others. Resolve sharpened into strategy. Resolve that would never let a slight go unanswered again. One of the younger associates leaned sideways, whispering to a colleague. Darius didn't catch the words, but he caught the smirk that followed. He had seen that look 100 times before. The kind that said, "He's lucky to be here." What they never understood was that he wasn't lucky. He was deliberate. Every step he had taken into rooms like this had been fought for. And if they thought he was silent because he was small, they were about to learn the cost of underestimating him. The airline manager wrapped up his pitch with a flourish, clearly proud of himself. "This is the future of air travel, gentlemen and ladies," he said, his tone heavy with authority. "And with your investment, we will lead that future together." Polite applause circled the table, investors leaning back in satisfaction. Yet in the center of it all sat Darius Cole, untouched by the performance, his hands lifted slowly, fingertips brushing the edge of his pen. For the first time since the meeting began, his eyes fixed directly on the manager who had refused his hand minutes earlier. The room quieted without knowing why, drawn to the sudden weight of his presence. Darius's voice, when it came, was low but resonant, a sound that commanded without needing to shout. "I have a question." And with those 4 words, the temperature of the room shifted. The airline manager moved down the line of investors with the rhythm of a man who had done it 1,000 times. His hand extended, his smile fixed, his words rehearsed. "Thank you for coming. We're glad you're here." Each investor received the same greeting, each gesture part of the performance of respect. Then he reached Darius Cole. For the briefest instant, his eyes flickered, hesitation sharp enough to slice the air. His hand, which had been steady for every other person, slowed. And then, in a motion so practiced it seemed intentional, he skipped forward, bypassing Darius altogether. His palm clasped the hand of the investor seated to his right, the smile unbroken, the words seamless. To the rest of the room, it might have gone unnoticed. But to Darius, it was searing. A handshake withheld wasn't just a lapse in etiquette. It was an announcement. "You are not one of us." He did not flinch. His expression remained impassive, his posture as unyielding as stone. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inside, everything did. For him, that silence carried weight built over generations. The denial of a handshake echoed the same refusal that once kept men who looked like him from entering these rooms at all. It was not a small thing. It was a reminder carved deep into history, one he carried with him every time he sat at tables like this. The manager continued, oblivious, shaking hands and moving forward with ease. His confidence filled the air, each gesture reminding the room who he believed held authority. But beneath the gleaming surface of charts and projections, another truth pulsed. He had drawn a line, and he had made sure everyone knew where Darius stood. Darius's jaw remained relaxed, his fingers still resting lightly on the leather folder before him. He refused to give the insult more visibility than it already had. But his silence was not consent. It was observation. His mind turned inward, gathering the insult, placing it alongside every other slight he had endured, weighing it not as a wound, but as evidence. He remembered boardrooms years ago when his ideas were dismissed, only to be repackaged by others and celebrated. He remembered being told he was impressive for his background, as though brilliance could not stand on its own unless tied to struggle. He remembered walking into partnerships where introductions skipped over him until his financial weight demanded recognition. Each memory was a scar, and the missing handshake pressed against all of them, reopening the old wounds with fresh sting. This wasn't anger in its raw form. It was calculation shaped by years of endurance. He had learned that power wasn't in the outburst. Power was in the pause, in the patience to act when the world least expected it. And as he sat there, every fiber of his being told him this moment would not be ignored. One of the investors down the line noticed. His eyes darted between the manager and Darius, a flicker of unease passing across his face. He had seen it too. The subtle rejection, the dismissal hidden in plain sight. But he said nothing. No one ever did in these rooms. The manager returned to the head of the table, clasping his hands as though satisfied with his performance. He launched back into the presentation, numbers filling the screen behind him, his voice echoing with confidence. "Together, we'll make history," he declared. Darius leaned back in his chair, gaze locked on the man who had skipped him. To anyone else, he looked like any investor waiting for his turn to speak. But behind his steady eyes, a storm had already begun. Because Darius knew what the manager did not. This wasn't just about an insult. It wasn't even about a handshake. It was about a culture that thrived on exclusion, a system built on making men like him invisible. And now, that system had just chosen the wrong man to dismiss. The room buzzed with approval as the manager wrapped up his pitch. Applause rippled across the table, voices rose with praise. But Darius sat still, unmoving, his focus sharper than ever. He had made his decision in the span of that skip gesture. What the airline manager didn't know was simple, yet devastating. The refusal to extend his hand had not erased Darius. It had awakened him. And with one choice, one call, one movement of his own, Darius Cole had the power to turn that moment of arrogance into their undoing. The applause faded, leaving only the faint buzz of the projector and the shuffle of expensive shoes against the carpet. Investors leaned back in their chairs, murmuring agreement, some nodding with practiced enthusiasm. On the surface, it was just another successful presentation. Beneath that surface, however, the air had shifted. Not everyone had missed what had happened at the table. Across from Darius sat James Liang, founder of Apex Ventures, a man whose name carried weight in Silicon Valley and Wall Street alike. James had made his fortune betting on companies others overlooked, placing faith in innovation before it became obvious. He was no stranger to being underestimated himself. Though wealth and influence shielded him now, he had once sat in rooms where his ideas were brushed aside until repeated by someone who didn't look like him. When the airline manager skipped Darius's hand, James noticed. His brow furrowed, his gaze flicking sharply toward Darius, then back to the manager. It was quick, subtle, but it was there. Recognition. For a long moment, their eyes met across the table. Nothing was said. No nod, no smile, no words of acknowledgement. Just a look, steady, unspoken, that carried more truth than any polished remark could. James knew what had happened. Darius knew James had seen it, and in that silent recognition, a thread of understanding formed. But James did not speak. Not then. That was how it always was in these rooms. Allies who saw the slight, who understood the weight of it, often chose silence. Silence to keep the peace. Silence to preserve deals. Silence to avoid becoming the one who disrupted the performance of professionalism. Silence, even when it burned. Darius understood that silence better than anyone. He had watched it play out countless times. Colleagues who looked away when he was dismissed, partners who swallowed discomfort rather than confront bias head-on. Their inaction didn't surprise him anymore, but it always confirmed the lesson he had learned young. No one was coming to save him. At the far end of the table, two younger investors leaned close, whispering. Their laughter was muted, a sharp sound muffled behind manicured hands. One slid a folded note across the table to the other. the kind of childish gesture meant to exclude while pretending it was innocent. Darius didn't need to know what was written. He knew enough from the smirk that followed. In their eyes, his presence at the table wasn't the mark of hard-earned brilliance. It was something to mock, something to minimize. The irony was lost on them. They didn't know that coal capital controlled enough capital to make or break entire industries. They didn't care that his signature on a deal carried the force of empires. All they saw was someone who didn't fit their narrow idea of who belonged in a leather chair around a mahogany table. James Leon watched too, expression unreadable. He tapped his pen against his portfolio, slow, deliberate, the sound almost rhythmic. He wanted to say something. Darius could see it in the way James's jaw tightened, the way his eyes lingered. But still, he stayed silent. The manager continued speaking, oblivious to the undercurrents. With your investment, we will redefine air travel. We will expand faster than any competitor in history. His voice rose with confidence. His slides painted a flawless picture. The investors nodded, dazzled by projections and promises. Darius sat unmoved. His silence wasn't agreement. It was endurance. He had become a master of it, of holding still while the storm raged inside, of letting the arrogance of others reveal itself without his prompting. Each slight, each whisper, each skipped handshake wasn't just insult. It was evidence. And he collected that evidence the way a strategist collects pieces on a chessboard, knowing each one could be turned into a decisive move. The weight of the skipped handshake pressed heavier now, amplified by the silence of the room. No one acknowledged it, no one dared name it, but the truth remained. Everyone had seen. Some pretended not to, some whispered instead. One man, James Leon, carried it in his eyes but chose not to speak it aloud. And yet silence doesn't erase injustice, it only delays the moment it explodes. The manager's voice filled the room again, but Darius wasn't listening. His focus had shifted. His gaze moved once more to James, who finally allowed the smallest of nods, barely perceptible as though to say, I saw it, I know. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was something. A spark waiting for fuel. Around them, the other investors shuffled their papers, eager to move on, eager to keep the meeting wrapped in comfort. They didn't realize the comfort was already gone. They didn't see how fragile the room had become, because what had looked like a minor omission was in fact a fracture. And fractures, left unacknowledged, spread until they bring down entire structures. As Darius closed his folder with deliberate calm, the sound echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. Heads turned toward him. The investors waited, uncertain whether he would speak or let the insult pass as so many before had. What they didn't know was this. The choice had already been made. The silence, the whispers, the skipped handshake, they weren't wounds. They were the trigger. And the man who had skipped him was about to discover just how much it would cost. The restaurant's low hum of conversation was a balm after the stiff, sterile air of the boardroom. Soft lighting glowed off crystal glasses, waiters gliding effortlessly between tables, the clink of silverware against porcelain carrying none of the malice he had endured hours before. Here the chairs weren't carved to intimidate, the table wasn't polished to reflect power. Here, there was space to breathe. Darius Cole had reserved a corner booth, one that gave him a clear view of the room. Old habit, never sit with your back exposed. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival, born of decades of navigating spaces where eyes followed him differently. Dad, a warm voice pulled him from thought. His daughter, Lena, slid into the booth across from him, her black blazer still crisp from the day, her laptop bag resting at her side. A financial analyst in her own right, Lena had inherited more than his sharp mind. She had his ability to read a room, to sense the undercurrent no one else named. You look tired, she said, studying his face. Darius offered a small smile. It was a day. The airline pitch she pressed. He didn't answer immediately. He lifted his glass of water, sipped slowly, buying himself the pause. Then he set it down, steady. Yes. Her eyes narrowed, already piecing it together. They disrespected you. He didn't flinch. A handshake, he said simply. Her jaw tightened. She knew. She didn't need the details. She had grown up watching him come home from meetings, tie loosened, silence heavy. She had lived in the shadow of his battles, felt the echoes of the slights he endured. Now, as a black woman in finance, she faced her own. They think ignoring you makes you smaller, she said, voice low, controlled. But you're not the one who should be worried. Darius studied her, Pride and sorrow collided in his chest. He had wanted her to inherit his resilience, but he hated that she had inherited his wounds too. "I let it pass," he said. Her brows rose. "Why?" "Because silence at times is stronger than reaction. It unsettles them more." She leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Or it lets them believe they can keep doing it. Dad, you've built something massive. You have weight, you've earned it. Why keep swallowing what you could crush?" Her words lingered, heavy and raw. He had always taught restraint. Choose the moment, don't waste energy on every slight. But now, across the table, his daughter questioned whether restraint had simply taught others they could dismiss him without consequence. She reached across, resting her hand over his. "Don't just carry it anymore. Make them feel it." He looked at her hand, then at her face, the fire in her eyes. It reminded him of her grandmother, his mother, who had worked double shifts just to keep food on their table, who told him as a boy that one day he would sit at tables they tried to keep him from. "Make them see you, Darius. Don't let them turn you invisible." Invisible. That was what the missing handshake had tried to make him. A man erased in plain sight. The waiter approached, menus in hand, but neither glanced down. Their meal became secondary to the conversation unfolding between them. "I've seen enough," Lena said firmly. "Their numbers might impress everyone else, but culture rots companies from the inside. If the man leading it can't respect the people across his table, then everything else is just gloss." Darius exhaled, long and slow. She was right. The slight wasn't personal. It was systemic, a symptom of something deeper. And unlike years past, he now had the leverage to do more than endure. The waiter returned, glasses filled, plates set down. They ate mechanically, each lost in thought, their conversation hanging between them like an unspoken pact. For years, Darius had taught her to play the long game. Now she was reminding him. Sometimes the long game required striking when the opportunity presented itself. As he set down his fork, the vibration of his phone against the leather booth startled him. He glanced at the screen, a message from his head of research. "Report complete. You'll want to see this. Something buried in their records doesn't add up." He stared at the words, pulse quickening. Whatever it wasn't small. His team knew better than to interrupt a dinner unless it mattered. And in that moment, Darius realized the insult in the boardroom had just unlocked something far bigger. The report arrived before midnight, a thick file sent to his secure inbox with the subject line, "Confidential, internal findings." Darius sat in his study, city lights spilling through the tall windows, the quiet of night broken only by the faint tick of the clock. He adjusted his glasses, opened the file, and began to read. The first page was blunt. 3 discrimination lawsuits in the last 5 years. Each had been settled quietly, with airtight non-disclosure agreements. Former employees, Black, Latino, Asian, had alleged pay gaps, stalled promotions, hostile work environments. Each case vanished into silence once money and legal paperwork closed the door. Darius scrolled deeper. Survey data from employees painted a bleaker picture. Minority staff rated the airline's culture significantly lower across every metric. Fairness, advancement, trust and leadership. Comments included words like glass ceiling, boys club, ignored, dismissed. The patterns were too clear to be coincidence. Then came the memo. It was dated just over a year ago from the desk of the very manager who had refused his hand. In clipped sentences, it described diversity initiatives as HR window dressing. Recruitment, the memo advised, should prioritize traditional candidates from trusted schools. The subtext was loud enough to pierce the page. Trusted schools, meaning the Ivy pipeline where privilege, not just grades, greased the entry. Candidates who fit the culture, meaning those who mirrored the faces already at the table. Everyone else? HR fluff. Darius leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. The words were familiar. He had heard them whispered in different forms his entire life. When he was passed over for internships because he didn't look the part. When a client once asked if he was the diversity hire. When his proposals were dismissed until a white colleague repeated them. Coded rejection wrapped in polite phrasing. He had carried those scars silently, transforming them into fuel, but they never stopped stinging. Now staring at the airline's internal documents, he saw those same patterns institutionalized, written into the very bones of a corporation that pretended to lead the future. The handshake wasn't a slip, it was a symptom. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back in Newark, a teenager watching his mother iron shirts at 2 in the morning before heading to her second shift. He remembered the promise he had made then, that he would get into those rooms, not just for himself, but so no one could tell his mother her son didn't belong. And yet, decades later, here he was, still being told in subtler ways that he was less than, that his presence was conditional, tolerated, but not embraced. His hand clenched around the pen resting on his desk. He thought of Lena's words from dinner. Don't just carry it anymore. Make them feel it. For years, he had chosen silence as strategy. He had taught himself to wait, to let arrogance reveal its own cracks. But silence had its limits. Silence allowed men like this airline manager to thrive, to dismiss, to erase. If he walked away now, they would continue, shaking hands with everyone else, skipping the next Darius, silencing the next voice. He flipped back to the financial summary. $50 billion in funding at stake. Investors dazzled by promises, blind to the rot underneath, blind or unwilling to see. If his firm stayed in, they would validate the culture described in those memos. If his firm pulled out, the airline's entire expansion collapsed. It wasn't just a business decision anymore. It was a moral one. Darius set the folder down, staring at the skyline beyond the glass. The city glittered as if mocking him. Bright towers built by men who had never once been asked to prove they belonged. He felt the weight of all those silences pressing down. Every slight he had endured, every insult his peers had swallowed, every voice cut short by contracts and NDAs. His phone buzzed again, another message from his research lead. We also found turnover spikes among minority managers. Most lasted less than 2 years. Many left without exit interviews. It's systemic. Systemic. That was the word. A rot, not a blemish, and it would spread unless someone forced it into the light. Darius rose from his chair, steadying himself with both hands on the desk. The anger he carried wasn't loud. It was heavy, focused, sharpened into resolve. He had spent a lifetime playing by their rules. Now it was time to write his own. He picked up his phone, scrolling through contacts until he reached the names that mattered most. Partners, allies, decision-makers who respected not just his capital, but his character. His thumb hovered, the choice already made. Because this wasn't only about one missed handshake, it was about centuries of exclusion concentrated into a single gesture. And for once, the consequence would not be swallowed. Tonight, Darius decided he would act. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced before him. The clock read just past 1 in the morning when Darius Cole finally reached for his phone. The city was still alive outside his window. Sirens in the distance, headlights streaking across the avenues, but inside his study, there was nothing but silence. A silence heavy enough to make the weight of his decision louder than any sound. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the names that mattered, the senior partners of Cole Capital, men and women who managed the kind of money that bent industries. Each of them owed part of their rise to the doors Darius had pried open, the deals he had brought to life. And each of them knew he did not call at this hour unless the stakes were monumental. The phone rang once, twice. A tired voice answered. "Darius?" "Wake the others," he said, his tone low, steady. "We're pulling out of the airline expansion. Effective immediately." A pause stretched across the line. "That's $50 billion in funding." "I know exactly how much it is," Darius replied. He could almost hear the questions forming. The spreadsheets, the forecasts, the return projections, all the language of capital that had blinded others in that boardroom. But for him, it came down to something different. Not just numbers, not just graphs. A culture exposed by a single gesture, a refusal that told the truth better than any financial model ever could. "They dismissed me," he said, voice sharpening. "Not just me, what I represent. You've seen the lawsuits, the memos, the turnover. It's not oversight, it's intent. If we back them, we endorse it. If we walk, they collapse." Silence filled the line again, heavier this time. Then another partner joined, then another, their voices merging into the call. Some hesitated, others agreed at once, but one by one they aligned. The weight of $50 billion shifted in real time, not by chance, not by markets, but by his word. Maya's narration slows here, holding the gravity. A lifetime of scars, dismissed ideas, stolen credit, skipped handshakes had brought him to this moment. And with one call, he was rewriting the rules. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about pride. It was about showing that silence had a cost, that exclusion had consequences, that a missed handshake could topple an empire. Darius listened as his partners confirmed the withdrawal. Each voice on the line was steady, resigned to the shockwaves that would follow. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the city skyline. For the first time since that boardroom, his breathing eased. "Draft the statement," he instructed. "We'll announce in the morning. No ambiguity. Make it clear our values don't align with theirs." A murmur of agreement followed. Papers shuffled, keyboards clicked. The machine was already in motion. He ended the call, setting the phone gently on the desk. His reflection stared back at him in the darkened glass of the window, unmoved, unbroken, resolute. One call, one sentence, one refusal turned into 50 billion gone. By sunrise, the tremors had already begun. The official statement from Coal Capital was brief, almost clinical. "After review, we are withdrawing our planned investment in Transworld Airlines. This decision reflects concerns about long-term cultural alignment and governance." No further explanation, no fiery language. Just 20 words dropped into the bloodstream of global finance. But in boardrooms and newsrooms across the city, the silence around those words made them deafening. By mid-morning, shareholders were on the phone, voices sharp, demanding answers. 50 billion doesn't just evaporate. One investor snapped. What did they see that we didn't? Others were less direct, but the unease was the same. The stock tickers showed it clearly, hesitation settling into the market like fog. Inside Transworld's glass tower, the airline manager who had skipped Darius's hand paced his office. His assistant hovered by the door, tablet in hand, reading headlines aloud. "Coal Capital walks away. What does it mean?" "Shock withdrawal from airline expansion deal." He waved her off with forced calm. "It's a negotiating tactic. They'll be back. These funds always posture." But the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. He knew Coal Capital didn't posture. When Darius pulled, it meant something the rest of the market would soon believe too. By noon, the whispers started. Journalists called their contacts inside the airline. Some spoke cautiously about low morale and retention issues. Others hinted at stories buried under non-disclosure agreements. It wasn't yet a headline, but the pieces were aligning. Reporters smelled a trail, and trails always led somewhere. At the shareholders' lunch meeting, the questions grew sharper. Why did he walk? What's under the surface? A director tried to reassure them with talk of strategy and resilience, but even as he spoke, his phone buzzed nonstop with incoming messages. The market wasn't listening anymore. It was watching, waiting, doubting. Across the city, in the newsroom of a major financial daily, an editor slapped a memo onto her reporter's desk. "Coal doesn't leave money on the table without a reason. Find out what happened in that boardroom." Phones rang, emails were sent, whispers grew into rumors. The manager attempted to seize control of the narrative. He scheduled an emergency press call, framed the withdrawal as a divergence in investment priorities, insisting the airline remained strong, that dozens of investors remain committed. But his voice cracked on the word committed, and one reporter caught it, jotting down in her notes. "He's rattled." Meanwhile, Darius kept silent. He let the statement stand on its own, no elaboration, no interviews. That silence made the story grow faster. Because in the absence of detail, speculation filled the gap, and speculation was more dangerous than fact. By the end of the day, one rumor had taken root, that Coal Capital had uncovered internal issues beyond finances. The words culture problem surfaced in investor forums, echoed in encrypted group chats between journalists, repeated in whispers around Wall Street bars. That evening, the airline's communications team gathered in a conference room, faces pale, voices tense. "If this gets out," one of them began, but the manager cut him short. "It won't. We control the story. Stick to the script." But the cracks were visible now. Employees inside the company had begun leaking fragments, anonymous comments about unfair promotions, about leaders who dismissed them, about meetings where voices were ignored. Individually, they seemed small. Together, they painted a picture too sharp to blur. The manager slammed his fist on the table. "We bury this, we get ahead of it. Coal wants to play games, fine. We'll show the market we don't need him." But the words rang hollow. Everyone in the room knew Coal's withdrawal wasn't just money leaving. It was credibility. And once credibility left, markets followed. That night, in his penthouse study, Darius set the report aside and poured himself a glass of water. He hadn't spoken a word publicly since the announcement. He didn't need to. The silence worked for him now, just as it had in the boardroom. His phone lit up on the desk, the screen vibrating against the wood. Unknown number. He considered letting it ring out, but something in him stilled. He answered. A voice on the other end, calm, deliberate, but edged with curiosity. "Mr. Cole, this is Rachel Whitman from the Financial Standard. We've heard whispers about what really happened in that room yesterday." Her words hung in the air. "We've heard what really happened in that room." The headline hit the internet just after dawn. Bold and unmistakable. Airline manager refuses handshake with black billionaire CEO. It was no longer whispers. It was out in the open. The story spread like wildfire, first on finance blogs, then on mainstream outlets, and finally across social media where outrage travels fastest. By mid-morning, the hashtag handshake denied trended worldwide. Screens lit up with the image of a skipped gesture, replayed in countless retellings. It wasn't just a snub anymore. It was a symbol. At airports in Atlanta, Chicago, and Los Angeles, protesters held signs reading, "Respect is not optional, and we belong at the table." Airline employees in uniform, off-duty but unafraid, marched silently through terminals holding placards with the same words. Travelers filmed them, uploading clips that racked up millions of views. What had begun as one man's insult inside a polished boardroom had now become a public reckoning. Inside the airline, the leaks began. Anonymous employees, emboldened by the coverage, sent messages to journalists. Stories of being passed over for promotions, of supervisors mocking accents, of diversity programs that existed only on paper. One account after another surfaced, an HR representative silencing complaints, a black pilot forced to train juniors who were promoted above him, Latina flight attendants disciplined more harshly than white colleagues for the same infractions. Each leak added another stone to the avalanche. The airline manager who had skipped Darius's hand tried to control the narrative. At a hastily called press conference, he denied the allegations, insisting the incident was being misinterpreted. His jaw was tight, his voice measured, but his eyes betrayed unease. The more he dismissed, the louder the voices outside grew. In one viral clip, a young black woman who worked as a baggage handler at JFK stood in front of cameras, her vest still dusty from the tarmac. "They act like we don't exist until they need the labor," she said. "I've seen people ignored, humiliated, passed over. What he did to Darius Cole? That's what this company does every day to us." Her words cracked something open. Suddenly it wasn't just about one skipped handshake. It was about a culture laid bare. The momentum built. Civil rights organizations issued statements, demanding accountability. Politicians weighed in. Investors who had once stood firm now faltered under the glare of public scrutiny. The stock price slipped again, each tick downward, a reminder that silence was no longer profitable. Through it all, Darius remained quiet. He gave no interviews, issued no personal statements. His withdrawal of funding had been explanation enough. The public filled in the blanks, and their voices carried further than anything he could have said. Maya's narration slows here, drawing the line clear. One act of dismissal had become the thread that pulled apart the whole fabric. What was meant to erase one man had instead exposed a system. Protests spread beyond airports. Outside the airline's headquarters, demonstrators gathered with banners stretching across the plaza. A seat at the table, not under it. Equal treatment, not empty promises. Their chants rose, echoing off glass towers, impossible to ignore. Employees still inside the company whispered to each other in break rooms, some fearful, others emboldened. A flight attendant told a journalist, "We were always told to keep quiet, that nothing would change. Now maybe it will." The snowball was unstoppable now. Each testimony fueled the next, each revelation deepened the cracks. What began as a missed handshake had transformed into a movement that forced the world to look at the airline, not as a company of numbers and planes, but as an emblem of exclusion. And still, Darius stayed in the shadows, watching. He didn't need to shout. The story carried its own weight now. His silence had become louder than their denials. By the week's end, television screens replayed the same images. Protesters waving signs at airports, anchors speaking of systemic discrimination, analysts warning of shareholder revolts. What had been hidden was exposed. What had been tolerated was challenged. The skipped handshake was no longer just about Darius Cole. It was about everyone who had been denied dignity in rooms, in offices, in uniforms across the airline. And for the first time, those voices were no longer silenced. They were rising together, and the company could not mute them. The boardroom that once exuded confidence now reeked of panic. Directors filed in with newspapers under their arms, screens glowing with plummeting stock charts. The airline's once proud logo on the wall seemed smaller, diminished under the weight of scandal. At the head of the table sat the manager, The same man who had skipped Darius Cole's hand. His tie was loose now, his forehead shining under the lights. He cleared his throat, but before he could speak, a board member cut him off. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The manager bristled. "This is being blown out of proportion. A misunderstanding." "50 billion is not a misunderstanding," another snapped. "Cole Capital doesn't walk away for no reason, and now every investor we have is questioning whether they should stay." The words landed hard. Several directors spoke over each other, a storm of accusation. Partnerships were already unraveling, banks pausing credit lines, suppliers demanding reassurances, marketing partners threatening to pull their campaigns unless the company made a statement that would calm the public. But no statement was enough. The protests outside, the leaks inside, the trending hashtags, none of it could be dismissed anymore. An older board member slammed a folder shut. "We built this company over decades, and you've jeopardized it in days. The public thinks we're a symbol of discrimination. Do you realize the damage?" The manager tried to stand his ground. "Cole is using this as leverage. He's weaponizing perception against us." A bitter laugh rippled across the room. "He didn't weaponize anything. You handed him the weapon when you refused to treat him like a man across that table." The silence that followed was brutal. Every eye turned toward the manager, and for once, he had no rehearsed words. Outside those walls, the financial bleeding worsened. Investors quietly announced withdrawals. Pension funds sold off shares. Ratings agencies downgraded the airline's outlook to negative. Each move compounded the crisis, turning whispers into open alarm. By late afternoon, partnerships were collapsing at speed. A major international carrier announced it was suspending talks for a joint venture. A technology firm pulled its sponsorship deal. The dominoes were falling one by one, each toppled by the weight of lost credibility. The board reconvened, tempers sharp, voices frayed. Some called for the manager's resignation. Others demanded a desperate fix. But they all agreed on one thing. The airline could not survive without finding a way back into Cole Capital's good graces. The chairman leaned forward, voice grim. "We need him. If we don't bring Cole back to the table, this company is finished." The manager swallowed hard, realizing the irony. Hours ago, he had skipped a handshake to erase Darius. Now, his survival depended on the very man he had dismissed. As the directors debated, a decision crystallized. They would reach out directly, bypassing layers of formality, bypassing pride. That evening, in his penthouse, Darius's phone lit up. Unknown number. He let it ring once, twice. Then, with deliberate calm, he answered. A voice came through, low and urgent. "Mr. Cole, this is the board of Transworld Airlines. We need to talk." The call began with hesitation on the other end, the sound of people shifting in expensive chairs, searching for words that would not betray desperation. Finally, the chairman's voice broke through. "Mr. Cole, we want to open the door again. We'd like to know what it would take for you to reconsider." Darius sat in his study, hands folded, gaze steady on the skyline. He let the silence stretch. For years he had endured these rooms, these voices, their coded dismissals. Tonight, he held the power, and they knew it. "What it would take," he said at last, "is more than money." The board shuffled. One director coughed. Another muttered something muffled. They had expected negotiations over percentages, maybe higher returns. Instead, Darius's tone carried something heavier, unyielding. "First," he said, voice sharp but calm, "leadership changes. The man who refused me in your boardroom will not remain in his role. If you want to move forward, he resigns publicly. No golden parachute, no quiet exit. Accountability begins with him." The line went quiet. They hadn't expected him to start with names. "Second," he continued, "a complete overhaul of your diversity policies. Not words in a glossy report, but actions. Recruitment beyond the same circles. Advancement for those you've overlooked. Transparent metrics, reported annually to shareholders and the public. If you cannot build a culture where respect is standard, then your growth is a lie." He paused only long enough to let the words land. He could picture their faces, men unused to being spoken to this way, men who had thought of him as an accessory in their deals. "And third," Darius said, his tone deepening, "an apology. Not buried in fine print, not delegated to an assistant. A direct acknowledgement that the behavior inside your boardroom reflects a broader pattern, and that it ends now. You will look into the camera, admit what was done, and commit to better. Anything less is not enough." The chairman cleared his throat. "Those are significant demands." "They're not demands," Darius replied. "They're conditions for survival. You asked what it would take. That's the answer. For a moment, only the faint hum of the city filled his ears. He could hear them debating in hushed tones, their confidence leaking away. They wanted him back, not just for his money, but for what his presence signaled: credibility. Without him, the empire was cracking. With him, they might salvage it. But this was no longer about salvaging their pride. This was about principle. Darius wasn't bargaining for himself. He was setting terms for every person silenced in those corridors, every worker pushed aside, every hand skipped because it didn't fit their picture of power. He leaned back in his chair, voice measured, final. Decide quickly. Comply or collapse. Either way, I won't lose sleep. The call ended abruptly, leaving the board to stew in silence. Some would argue for compliance, others for defiance. Pride would clash with panic, but the truth hung heavy. The future of the airline no longer rested in their hands. It rested in the decision to meet the terms of the man they had dismissed. The question now was simple, but deadly. Would they swallow their arrogance to survive, or cling to it and collapse? The announcement came on a gray Monday morning, carried by every major outlet. Transworld Airlines CEO steps down amid scandal. The man who had once strutted through boardrooms with effortless entitlement now appeared behind a podium, shoulders stiff, jaw tight, eyes darting at the cameras. Gone was the veneer of authority. The statement in front of him wasn't his own. It was forced upon him by the very board that had once shielded him. I am resigning effective immediately, he said. The words flat, stripped of the polish he once prided himself on. It has become clear that my leadership no longer serves the best interests of this company. No golden parachute. No glowing farewell. Just an ending carved out of disgrace. Hours later, the chairman of the board stood in his place, facing the press with words crafted to sound strong but lined with surrender. We recognize that incidents inside our leadership reflected a lack of respect and inclusion that cannot continue. We apologize to our employees, to our customers, and to every individual who felt unseen in our spaces. Change is not optional, it is mandatory. The cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, and the statement was replayed on screens around the world. For some, it felt like closure. For others, it was only a beginning. Because this wasn't just about one resignation or one apology. It was about the fracture that moment had exposed. Maya's narration slows here, pressing the truth. What had started with a skipped handshake had become proof that arrogance has a cost. The resignation was symbolic, yes, but the impact reached further. Shareholders now demanded transparent policies. Employees, emboldened by the spotlight, organized to hold leadership accountable. Other corporations watched, nervously aware that their own boardrooms were not immune. And within communities that had long carried the burden of exclusion, there was something else. A shift in belief. Proof that silence, when broken, could ripple into change. Darius did not gloat, he did not give interviews or parade his victory. That was never the goal. He sat in his office, reading the resignation letter, listening to the hollow apology, and knew this was not about revenge. It was about setting precedent. About ensuring that dignity was no longer optional, that respect was not negotiable. The image of the fallen manager circulated widely, once a face of authority, now a cautionary tale. And behind that image, a deeper truth remained. Racism, even dressed in suits and disguised in gestures, was still alive in the highest towers of power. But now, at least, it was visible, and visibility is where change begins. For the airline, the resignation was a desperate attempt to stabilize. For Darius, it was proof that no one is too untouchable to be held accountable. The ripple had started, and it would not stop here. The dust had settled, but the message remained carved into stone. One moment in a polished boardroom, one refusal to extend a hand, had spiraled into a reckoning that stripped arrogance from its pedestal and forced a corporation to face what it had long ignored. A gesture so small, almost invisible, became the spark that revealed how exclusion isn't isolated. It's built into systems, into cultures that pretend to value progress while hiding behind polished numbers and hollow promises. Darius Cole had seen it all his life, and for once, he refused to let silence protect the offender. Maya's voice closes steady, deliberate. A handshake denied became a movement funded by truth. It was never about revenge. It was never about headlines. It was about principle. The principle that respect cannot be rationed, that dignity is not optional, and that power must bend when it denies humanity. The resignation of one man and the apology of one board may not erase the scars, but they prove that arrogance is not untouchable. And they showed what happens when silence is broken with resolve. Darius walked away not just with victory, but with validation. That standing firm against injustice can ripple outward, empowering countless others who have been ignored in rooms like his. His decision carried weight far beyond $50 billion. It carried hope. And now, the question turns to you. What would you have done if you were in Darius's seat? Would you have walked away quietly? Or would you have used your weight to force the truth into the open? Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't just tell us what you think, tell us where you're watching from. Let the world know your voice, your country, your perspective, because stories like this matter everywhere. The boardroom may have tried to erase a man with one skipped gesture, but instead, they sparked a reminder that justice isn't granted. It's taken, earned, and defended. And when one man stood up against a culture of dismissal, he proved that even the smallest insult can fuel the largest change.